my co-author. Ooh, um, just sharing my screen. Slideshow from the start. Right, someone give me a thumbs up if they can see that. Does that look okay? Yes, perfect. Thank you, Alistair. Yeah, Craig Sapola is my co-author of Archaeological Theory in the New Millennium, and he would not forgive me if I let this opportunity go past without making sure everyone was aware of that, especially now it's being recorded, so it's there for perpetuity. I couldn't let that slide. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's great to be back in Cardiff. It would be even better to be actually in Cardiff and seeing you all face to face, although I know there are many people in the audience who are not themselves in Cardiff, and it's great to be speaking to you as well. The research I'm going to be talking about today goes all the way back to my PhD, and maybe even parts of it to my master's thesis that I wrote under Alistair's supervision. I finished my PhD 15 years ago. I already confessed that live on Zoom, so there's no need to pretend that it wasn't an awfully long time ago. And I've kind of been playing with these ideas ever since, expanding them, taking them in different directions, trying to think about them whilst working on other projects, working with other people, and trying to kind of always circling back around to the British Neolithic as my ideas have developed and changed, and it kind of integrated other theoretical perspectives into them. So it's really fantastic to kind of do, perhaps in some ways, the first presentation about this book. Now it's finished. So it's kind of a first run at presenting the book, but please don't be too mean because it's too late to change anything. So that would be, it would be devastating to find out it's all wrong at this stage when it's yet to come out. So fingers crossed you don't totally shoot it down. I'm sure there'll be plenty for many members of the audience to disagree with. So what I want to do today is talk about where we are with the Neolithic. And in lots of ways, I think this is an absolutely fantastic time for Neolithic studies. Alistair was saying that to me just beforehand. And I saw his talk for the Society of Antiquaries a couple of weeks ago, flagging up all of the fantastic new discoveries that are happening through commercial archaeology, through academic archaeology, through new scientific approaches, both to things like Bayesian statistical analysis of radiocarbon dates, but also isotopes and aDNA and all these sorts of things. Now, for those of you not quite as embroiled in the Neolithic as perhaps I am, or certainly people like Alison and Alistair are, then I'll give you some kind of little bit of background to those in a moment so we get a sense of how things are developing. What I do want to suggest, though, is that these new approaches, new dates, new facts, new science, new aDNA by themselves aren't going to give us new Neolithics. They often refine and improve what we already think. Sometimes they challenge us, but by themselves, I don't think they transform how we conceptualize the past. This shouldn't be taken for a moment to say that I don't welcome all of these kinds of approaches. I think they're essential and have been absolutely fantastic for giving us new depth and insight into the period that I love the most. John Robb would always say that all periods are equal, but some periods are more equal than others. And that's certainly how he and I feel about the British Neolithic, well, the Neolithic. He wouldn't feel that way about the British Neolithic. He'd see it as a strange, isolated outpost on the edge of Europe, but I'd see it about the British Neolithic. So in my book that I'm kind of talking about today, what I try and do is think about some of the issues that I think archaeology is facing at the moment. And I try and think about the ways in which we can develop theoretical approaches that allow us to build on the fantastic insights we're gaining through the different kinds of scientific approaches I've mentioned a moment ago, but also allow us to kind of try and ask questions in slightly different ways. This isn't some kind of claim to paradigm shift or revolution. It's not about throwing any babies out with any forms of bathwater, but it is about trying to reorientate how we conceptualize elements of the past, the historical actors that are at work, what a human body is, what monuments do, in a way that perhaps open up slightly different kinds of questions when we're thinking about a period like the British Neolithic. And I hope some of the approaches I set out in the book have kind of ramifications beyond the individual period itself, but it is primarily a study of Britain in the Neolithic, in part because, again, as I was sort of giving away in the kind of preamble chat before we got going, before we got started recording, one of the accusations that often gets leveled at the kind of work that I do is that there's all this hopefully elegant theoretical exposition followed by a case study of one pit or one pot or one particular deposit from a causewayed enclosure ditch. And it doesn't amount necessarily to kind of something like a big engagement with a particular period or a set of archaeological problems. And I hope that the book, if it does nothing else, amounts to an extended engagement with a set of archaeological data, and extended those case study chapters are, as you'll find out if you ever get to read it. Now, I'm obviously not going to try and present the entire of the book's arguments today. What I want to do instead is kind of peel out three particular vignettes from the book, three particular kind of areas from the three of the main case study chapters that I think start opening up some of the ideas that I'm having about how we can talk about the Neolithic. And within this, I'll touch on some of the theoretical approaches that I'm using. Spoiler alert, yes, it does indeed involve the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and Deleuze by himself in particular, actually. And I'm going to try and think about some of the ways in which they help us think differently about the Neolithic. So those three vignettes are going to be about what we might call a life proper to matter, thinking about the question, what could a body do? And then thinking about machines for world building. And these three things are going to cover kind of materials, they're going to cover bodies, and they're going to cover architecture, and particularly monumental architecture in the talk today, or examples of monumental architecture. And what I want to suggest is that by thinking about these kind of topics through the lens of Deleuze's work and Deleuze and Guattari's work, we can begin to think about how ontological concepts come to the fore. These are the kind of conceptual elements that help us understand how to conceive of and talk about the differences between Neolithic pasts and our present world today. And I think that raises some more challenges and some kind of interesting reflections on the role of the kinds of philosophy and theory that I do when we're thinking about the past. And that's what I'll talk about kind of in the conclusion briefly, about some of the ramifications of these ideas and some of the consequences and what they mean, and whether we're at risk perhaps of simply imposing a particular philosophical take onto the Neolithic, or whether we might be in a position where we can really start saying something that's emergent from the interaction between the archaeologist, the material of the past, and the particular theoretical perspectives that we take. So for those of you less familiar with the Neolithic, let me just give you some very, very, very broad brush outlines. I mean, if you're in Cardiff, presumably the walls have become so seeped with Alistair's knowledge that you probably absorb this just walking up and down the corridor, and you'll know all this immediately already. But for anybody watching who hasn't had the fortune of exploring those corridors for themselves, or anyone who isn't into the British Neolithic, these are just some very, very broad brush outlines to go give us some basics. So it's the first period of farming in Britain, and begins around 4100 calibrated BCE. Alistair's work has shown how it begins in different parts of the country at different times, but we can perhaps trace the earliest moments back to around 4100. It involves domesticated animals, particularly cows, but also sheep, goats, and pigs right from the very start. And of course, the growing of different kinds of crops as well. There's probably a lot we can say about varied levels of mobility. We're certainly seeing houses right from the very start in some regions, but also areas that have less in terms of seemingly permanent occupation, and probably variation in terms of the levels of mobility in different regions and across time. I think imposing a single static vision of mobility throughout the whole Neolithic would be a mistake. And there's still lots to be done drawing on the kind of developing work of isotope studies, particularly around mobility, and that I'll touch on a little bit more, but I won't talk in depth about today, that are starting to open up a real sense of people moving sometimes seasonally between different landscapes, sometimes across regions. And many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the kinds of mobility arguments that are emerging around Stonehenge, both in terms of the animal bone work that Richard Madgwick has done at Cardiff, but also more recently, Mike Parker Pearson's arguments about building on the long-standing arguments that the blue stones are moving from the Preseli Mountains to Stonehenge, and having perhaps first stopped on in a stone circle close to their original source first. We can generally divide the Neolithic into three kinds of periods. This is the sort of rough and ready chronology that will have Alistair crying at the moment as he watches this, but we can generally divide it into perhaps the early, the middle, and the late Neolithic period. These, of course, are very crude divisions, but they're kind of helpful to give us a sense of the structure of the period, and different kinds of elements of evidence dominate in some of these periods in different kinds of ways. But again, these are very rough and ready chronological divisions. And thanks to Alistair's work in particular, we have a much better understanding already of the chronology of the fourth millennium between 4000 and 3000 BCE. And I think we will have soon, hopefully, a much better understanding of the third millennium as well. And obviously the period is famous for its monuments. You've seen two portal dolmens already in the slides that I've shown, just random photos chosen from my collection of visiting these sites over the years. So as I said at the start, I think this is an incredibly exciting time to be studying the Neolithic. I mean, I first fell in love with the Neolithic in the kind of early 2000s, and, you know, moved down from Sheffield to Cardiff to study it with Alistair because I thought it was such a fascinating period. And since then, so much of our understanding has really been transformed by the additional knowledge we're gaining of the period. I think broadly speaking, we can kind of divide these three major areas of growth in our knowledge into three different areas. I think the new chronologies through the Bayesian modelling of radiocarbon dates has been absolutely critical, and needless to say, again, Alistair's work here has been at the forefront of this. I'm going to say a little bit more about all of these in a moment, so I'll go through these quite quickly here. I think new scientific approaches, particularly around aDNA and isotopic analysis, have given us huge new insights into diet and mobility and into the start and end of the Neolithic in Britain. And of course, we're seeing new excavations and discoveries up and down the country all of the time. We're seeing these in the work that commercial archaeologists are doing in pipeline and road projects and in advance of other forms of development. And we're seeing it in commercial excavations, in research excavations as well. So lots of new sites coming to the fore up and down the country, which is really filling in blanks, but also telling us lots about areas of the country we already knew quite a lot about, like mainland Orkney or the Wessex area around Salisbury Plain and Stonehenge, for example. So to say a little bit more about each of those, I do think the kind of the chronologies first and foremost are really important to this because they allow us a sense of the rhythms of social life and the development of different forms of monuments and different forms of architecture, different forms of lifeways that were dominating in Britain, particularly in the 4th millennium BC. I know that another Cardiff alumnus, Seren Griffiths, has recently got an AHRC grant working with Julian Thomas to look at the 3rd millennium in a similar kind of way. So I hope we'll soon have that. And Alistair was telling me a moment ago that he's working on kind of updating the 4th millennium evidence, building on all the new radiocarbon dates that have arrived in the 10 years or so since Gathering Time was published. The kind of insights we gain from these from Bayesian analysis include things like many monuments are much shorter lived than we thought we were. There are periods of very particular intensive elements of monument building, the 3650s and times like that, where particularly monuments are constructed. We get a sense of how some causewayed enclosures, for example, one pictured on the cover of Gathering Time here, are used for perhaps less than a generation. Others are used intensively or perhaps episodically over centuries, and we get a sense of how often that happens and which enclosures, places like Hambledon Hill and Eton and Windmill Hill, were used more intensively over a longer period of time. And this allows us to talk in much more detail about the kinds of activities and practices, the kind of roles that people are playing, the kinds of performances that are taking place at these different sites. And so it's opened up really radically new understandings of this period, I think. It also gives us a really interesting understandings of particular sites. This is Barnhouse in Orkney, where the work of Alistair's Times of Our Lives project combined with Colin Richards' outstanding excavations of the site have given us new insights into the development of one particular late Neolithic or mid to late Neolithic settlement in Orkney. And we now get the sense of the importance of House 2 and the early phases of the site, and then the kind of growing kind of dominance of Structure 8, that big structure at the bottom of the slide there, towards the end of the site's occupation. And these kind of chronological models help us really answer questions about the nature of pottery production at the site, about how it's being decorated differently in different houses, and whether this represents change through time or whether it represents genuinely different practices between different houses. And these are the kinds of questions that without the kind of Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon dates would still be struggling to answer. Similarly, new scientific approaches are giving us fantastic new insights into different areas of the Neolithic. Ancient DNA analysis has, of course, given us a real clear picture of, well, it's given some very clear information about the start of the Neolithic in Britain, and particularly about the importance of the arrival of people coming from the continent into Britain. It's also telling us more information about the end of the Neolithic, and again, the arrival of beaker folk. I think it's really interesting to see Tom Booth and Joanna Brooke and Selina Brace's new paper kind of picking apart some of the complexity present in the data at the end of that period, in the arrival of the beaker period, in contrast to perhaps some of the clear-cut narratives that have appeared earlier about that. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see interesting levels of complexity emerging as ancient DNA develops at the start of the period as well. And of course, isotope analysis similarly is telling us more and more about the mobility. People like Sam Neill's work looking at the mobility of people who were buried at Hambledon Hill, which is the site you can see on the screen here, moving down from the southwest, where we already know that pottery is coming and polished stone axes are coming to this particular causewayed enclosure in Dorset, but also perhaps at places like at Hazleton North, tracing, which is a chambered tomb in Oxfordshire, tracing the movement of people and cows seasonally between different kinds of locations. These insights are opening up details into the rhythms of people's lives on an annual basis that were, I mean, I couldn't have imagined when I arrived in Cardiff in the early 2000s. And this is built upon slightly older understandings of diet that have emerged from stable isotope analysis in particular. So ancient DNA and stable isotope analysis, amongst other new approaches, are already opening up really interesting understandings of the period, and I think giving us ever more detailed narratives about the kinds of lives people were leading, and I'm sure will only be added to in the coming decades. Finally, of course, new excavations. This is Nessa Brodka in Orkney on the slide here, one of the most famous excavations currently taking place. But up and down the country, we're finding houses, more causeway enclosures, dense clusters of occupation, big midden sites being published. We're understanding new histories of monumental landscapes, whether it's places like Orkney or whether it's places like Stonehenge or it's everywhere in between. There really is a sense in which we're getting more and more information about these kind of landscapes and these sites through these excavations, which again is fantastic and fascinating and only to be applauded in deepening and broadening our understanding of the complexity and variability, but also the overarching patterns of life in the Neolithic of Britain. Now, the argument I want to make today, in any way that we should be rejecting the insights of these different scientific approaches, or that we should be doing less of it, or that they are absolutely critical to how we're going to develop our stories of this period moving forward. However, I do wonder if they're really transformative in and of themselves, or whether what they're tending to do is to refine pictures we already have in our heads, whether they're tending to reinforce certain kinds of narratives, and whether we might be better off, or not better off, but whether we need to couple these new approaches with other kinds of questions, other kinds of lines of interrogation of the evidence, other ways of thinking about it, that allow us to conceptualize the past differently, to make other kinds of pasts possible, if you will, that make other kinds of worlds in the past possible for us to think about. I have no question that the kind of understanding we currently have of the Neolithic will only be refined further with further scientific analyses, more sites being excavated, more data being modeled, all of those things. But I do wonder if we want to say something different about it, whether we need to try and develop other kinds of starting points. And I've outlined some of the concerns I have around ancient DNA evidence, for example, with this in a paper I wrote with Rachel Krellin that came out in Archaeological Dialogues last year. So I don't know if it's old-fashioned or not, but in an old-fashioned way, I would maintain that archaeological theory remains incredibly critical to what we do as a discipline and the questions we ask and how we conceptualize the past. And this is something I've explored in a recent book that came out last year with a series of co-authors, looking at where we are with archaeological theory and thinking about some of the dominant concerns that are in the theoretical world that in many ways I don't think are necessarily articulating always with the kinds of narratives we're constructing about the British Neolithic. I think if you think about the broader challenges that archaeology faces more widely, not just in terms of how we understand one particular period of the past, but how we articulate with modern political concerns about heritage, how we articulate with concerns about the relationship between human beings and non-humans in relation to the Anthropocene and climate crisis. If you think about the debates that have shaped the world we've been in the last 12 months, whether it's the treatment of statues, whether it's the conception of human bodies within Black Lives Matter protests, whether it's the role in which one particular non-human, a virus, has rewritten the world we live in rapid time. I think that we need to think very carefully about how we can draw on contemporary archaeological thought to help articulate the incredible insights we're gaining into Neolithic life to answer other kinds of questions, as well as the kind of traditional historical ones we've been asking. I think we can say other kinds of things about the past if we're willing to start from different kinds of positions, if we're willing to open ourselves up to different kinds of perspectives. That isn't for a moment to dismiss either the kinds of narratives that we're currently writing, or to suggest that any of the approaches I've outlined so far are somehow mistaken or a waste of time or money or anything like that. My argument today is not for a moment that we should abandon what we're doing. What I'm saying is that we should add to what we're doing to open up new kinds of questions, other ways of thinking. And I think that with that, we can gain richer and more complex visions of the past, but also contribute and connect to other kinds of debates that are taking place in the present as well. So that's the challenge, the small and rather insignificant challenge that I set myself in my book, Assembling Past Worlds. In this book, what I try to do is set out what I see as a series of really critical challenges that face archaeology at the moment, and particularly that are emerging from contemporary archaeological thought and contemporary archaeological theory. And in the book, I kind of identify 7 of them, which started off as a joke in a previous presentation because I call them the Magnificent Seven, but I've stuck with them as 7 ever since. They're by no means the only challenges one could identify or articulate, but 7's probably enough for one book to be getting on with. At least that's what I thought. And I then try and set out some of the theoretical resources that I think give us an opportunity to really engage with these problems differently. And as was alluded to already, the kind of way in which I think about the world draws especially on the work of people like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and also on the people that Deleuze in particular was drawing on, like Henri Bergson and Baruch Spinoza and others. But particularly Deleuze's work is the kind of key touchstone for me as giving me a set of tools to think differently about the past with. It's not so much about whether or not Deleuze is right about how the world works, but what I've found is that I've used his thought in a way that, for me at least, is very productive for conceptualizing the past differently. So in the book, I try and develop a series of kind of Deleuzean tools that allow me to respond to the 7 challenges that I see archaeological thought as laying down. And then I turn in a number of extended case study chapters to think about these at different scales of analysis, or if you like, different kind of points of intensity where particular questions come to the fore. And I want to give you a kind of flavor of some of those issues, some of those points of intensity, if you like, in the rest of today's talk. He says, checking how long he's been talking for. Yeah, that's okay. That's not too bad. So as I said earlier on at the start, I'm going to look at 3 particular areas. I want to start off by looking at a life proper to matter. I then want to think about what could a body do. And I want to finish off with this claim about machines for world building, which is going to be about monuments in particular. So let's start with a life proper to matter. And one of the things I've enjoyed most in recent archaeological writing about the Neolithic is the way in which many archaeologists have attended to matter, and stone in particular, actually. I think there's lots more to be said about other materials, but stone in particular in really exciting and interesting ways. On the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see a diagram courtesy of Mark Gillings from his and Josh Pollard's 2016 article in Cambridge Archaeological Journal about Avebury. And in this article, Gillings and Pollard explore what happens when we don't see the stones at Avebury as static monoliths standing where they are, but on the move, having crossed the landscape. And the landscape here that was previously static and stayed comes alive. It becomes full of flows and flux. It's something that my PhD student, former PhD student, she's long graduated now, Emily Banfield, has thought about in this landscape, thinking about how different kinds of clay and stone come together to create different kinds of movement. On the right-hand side, you'll see a photo of the Ring of Brodgar, one of the famous stone circles in Orkney. And here we can think of Jane Downs and Colin Richards' work, tracing the movement of stones to this particular site, how it builds almost a kind of geological, not a map exactly, but a set of geological connections across mainland Orkney that allow us to think about the forms of relationship that are made manifest in a particular site like this. Colin Richards and Jane Downs' work has stressed how the shallow stone holes at the Ring of Brodgar suggest that getting these stones upright isn't nearly as important as getting them to the site in the first place, and actually them falling over may be part of a continued pattern of movement here. Other people, including another Cardiff graduate, Vicky Cummings, have also written about the materials that make up chambered tombs, in her case particularly at Blast Hill in Kentire, thinking about the complex ways in which materials amalgamate together to make these particular sites. And in these approaches, we see stone not as static, not simply as a material that people are working, but something much more vibrant, something much more exciting, something much more living than we might previously otherwise have conceptualized it. And I think this is something, I mean, these approaches are already, I think, implicitly drawing on the work, or sometimes explicitly drawing on the work of Deleuze and Guattari. But this is something we can begin to develop further, I think, by considering more properly what Deleuze and Guattari call a life proper to matter. It's a direct quote from A Thousand Plateaus. We can think about the vibrancy of the world, both organic and inorganic. We can think about how this allows for historical actors beyond the human that are operating at different scales from human beings, that allow us to think about relationality, the way in which the world emerges out of networks or assemblages of relations quite differently than it does if we focus simply on stone, for example, as inorganic, dull, lifeless matter, awaiting the enlivening hand of a human being to come along to it. It also helps us focus, I think, very specifically on the historicity of materials. That is how materials have different properties and capacities at different points in time. They have histories too. The things a flint can do, a flint nodule can do in the hands of a skilled napper in the 4th millennium BC are entirely different to what it can do in my hands right now if I had one by me. I don't, unfortunately, should have had a flint nodule around me to wave around on camera. These materials gain a particular historical capacities in particular sets of relationships. And out of this, we can think about how people too emerge as far more historically specific within these assemblages of humans and non-humans, of animals and plants and landscapes that exist at particular points in time. Alongside these two kind of critical considerations, I think, of historicity and relationality, or how things are historically emergent, if you like, I also think we can think much more about the process of difference itself. Now, this is sometimes quite a hard concept to get one's head around, but the way in which archaeologists have traditionally thought about difference tends to be in a way that posits a kind of original identity from which things differ. So when we talk about typologies, for example, we kind of always implicitly imagine a kind of idealized grooved-ware pot, to use an example that's illustrated on the screen here. This isn't an idealized one, that's an actual drawing of a grooved-ware pot from Martlesham in Surrey. But we tend to imagine that, and then we think about how different a particular pot is from our kind of idealized grooved-ware pot or our idealized beaker or idealized polished stone axe or whatever it might be. This form of difference is what rests on what Deleuze will call a logic of identity. To take a more contemporary example, you can imagine two cars. And if you want to say, what's the difference between these two cars? You'd say, well, my old car was small and red and it was made in Japan and it was designed in Japan and it was called Bertie. And my new car is black and it was designed in France and it's called Jean-Baptiste. These are, by the way, genuine cars. And we can see that as a kind of, again, starting off sharing a kind of logic of identity where we have a notion of car, and then we discuss how things are different from each other. The kinds of difference that Deleuze would ask us to talk about is quite different from that. It's the flow of differential forces in the world, the way in which, as we press our fingers into clay, we differentiate a particular shape. It's the way in which intensive differences in energy systems produce patterns of weather in the world. It's the way in which intensive efforts of napping again and again and again, and polishing and polishing and polishing, produce a polished stone axe. These acts of differentiation, as Deleuze would call it, individuate particular objects in the world. This allows us to think about how difference makes the world. It brings the world into existence. And through that, how objects themselves act to differentiate and create different possibilities for action, different possibilities for history, different possibilities for being human. Difference, I think, actually has much wider ramifications from this. And let's cite another Cardiff graduate in Penny Bickle, of course, who's been exploring these notions of difference in relation to gender in linear band ceramic world. That's the kind of Neolithic of Central Europe. Her work published last year in Cambridge Archaeological Journal is developing that particular line of difference thinking in really important ways. So what can we draw from thinking about materials as relational and as historic and as differential and differentiating when it comes to thinking about the Neolithic of Britain? What happens when we think about, say, a polished stone axe in this particular kind of way? Well, I think we can start rethinking how we conceptualize motivation, how we conceptualize agency, how we conceptualize what it was that made people do the things that they did. I wonder if we can't make a kind of broad conceptual claim that in the Neolithic, matter moved people. We think about how at the very start of the Neolithic, it's clear that places like flint mines or flint resources in the south of the country, flint as a material, but also potentially axe factory sites like Langdale in the northwest, were attracting people from the continent from very early on. People are being drawn in by particular material capacities and properties that exist in the landscape prior to their arrival. We can think here, not just about the movement of people through the world, but the movement of objects and how objects and things and stones are dragging people with them as much as people are dragging those stones. We can think about how rivers shape particular landscapes and guide people through them in particular kinds of ways. We can think about how wooden trackways laid down after the coppicing of trees in places like the Somerset Levels create particular lines of movement, lines of flight, if you want, through different kinds of landscapes. Matter here takes on quite a different set of capacities once we focus on its relationality, its historicity, and its differential nature. It begins to become part of a way that Neolithic worlds become much more intensively folded into one another. We can think about how places move, like at the Ring of Brodgar, where those stones from across mainland Orkney were moved there. Or we can think about how Avebury captures the history of those movements of stone across the landscape, folding places where those stones came from to the places where they end up. We can think about geography and geology differently once we start thinking about matter in these much more vibrant and complex ways. As we'll see in a moment, I think this kind of differential movement of matter and this kind of the way in which matter move people also plays out in some of the other concepts I want to try and bring out from my talk today. Oh. So I'll take a swig of water actually first. My throat's getting dry. Let's turn to my second kind of question then. I've already slightly altered in this slide, as you can see. We've moved from what could a body do to what could a dead Neolithic body do, just to narrow things down a little bit. When we talk about Neolithic funerary practice, a very coarse way of dividing it up that's pretty inaccurate, like most coarse stereotypes, but not entirely inaccurate, is that we can divide things up into different phases within the Neolithic. We might associate the early Neolithic with the fragmentation of the dead within monuments. On the left-hand side, you'll see Fussel's Lodge, the mortuary chamber of Fussel's Lodge, a Neolithic long barrow from southern Britain, within which bodies were placed and then in some cases rearranged and put together. Quite interestingly, there are two bone groups, Fussel's Lodge, which were assembled to look like skeletons from the bones of different people. In the middle here, you'll see Lifts Low, a kind of classic middle Neolithic burial with grave goods, where a particular individual was buried in the Peak District with an antler mace head, a very amazing and kind of unique form of pot, and then a set of paired grave goods, including a couple of kite arrowheads, some partially polished flint axes, some lumps of ochre, boar's tusks, and other things like that. On the right-hand side, you'll see a cremation deposit being excavated at Forteviot in Scotland, one of a kind of series of cremation cemeteries we know from the late Neolithic. Courtesy of Kenny Brophy for the thanks to Kenny Brophy for that photo there, where cremation. And you can often divide the Neolithic up rather crudely into this notion that we move from fragmentation in the early Neolithic to whole burial in the middle Neolithic to cremation in the late Neolithic. Now, that's absolutely not true, in the sense that a Neolithic site that I've excavated, the earliest deposit there is a cremation burial from around 3700 BC. So you actually get cremation all the way through the Neolithic, you get whole burial all the way through the Neolithic, and you get fragmentation all the way through the Neolithic. But what we do see is some kind of waxing and waning of these different kinds of traditions in particular moments where they reach real points of intensity. Cremation cemeteries are a great example of that. There we get cremation all the way through the Neolithic, but it's clear there's this kind of intensive point, perhaps just in the first couple of centuries of the third millennium, where lots of cremation cemeteries comparatively are being put together in Britain. Now, so I'm glossing over still huge amounts of complexity there, unquestionably. Now, Deleuze in his work says that one of the most important questions we can ask is, what can a body do? And here he's drawing on Spinoza, one of his kind of absolute favorite ever philosophers. The prince of philosophers is what Deleuze would call Spinoza. Spinoza is a 17th century Dutch philosopher, for those of you who don't know, really interesting guy, excommunicated from the Catholic Church. He grew up Jewish, lived a very interesting life, was a kind of someone trying to write against a Cartesian way of thinking associated with René Descartes, a more famous French philosopher from a similar kind of period. And Deleuze draws on Spinoza to kind of say, if we want to understand what a body is, we have to ask what it can do. And nobody knows that yet, because what a body can do isn't set in stone. It's not fixed. It's not cut off. It depends on the relationships it's enmeshed in the world. I can do different things connected to a computer and via Zoom than I can if these things are taken away from me. The things my body can do depend upon the historical relations of the world in which I find myself. So Deleuze argues that we need to map bodies in particular kinds of ways. We need to see how they move and where they go, what they do, relations of movement and rest, as he calls them, or what he refers to as longitude. But also we need to think of what bodies are capable of at any moment, the affects, the way they can affect other bodies and can be affected in turn, their latitude, he would call that. And this concept of affect that emerges out of Spinoza and out of Deleuze's reading of Spinoza has sparked a huge realm of academic study. If you go and look in critical theory, or you go and look in anthropology, or you go and look in geography in particular, you'll see that affects become one of the kind of dominant themes of how people write about architecture, about material things, about politics. It's a really central topic for people. And it's something that obviously, in a way, I've been exploring for some time, going right back to my PhD as well. So we can think about, drawing on Deleuze's work with Spinoza, I think, how bodies can affect and be affected, and how they emerge historically and relationally in different kinds of ways. We can ask, what can a body do? So let's turn to some Neolithic bodies to think about that. And here I'm going to talk about two different bodies. The one on the left you've already met, that's Live Slow. And actually, of course, if we get out of thinking about bodies as just being human bodies, there's quite a lot of different bodies in that grave, both the body of the person, but also the body of different objects that are located within it. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a different body, a fragment of one. And this again is non-human. This is a cow skull, the front part of a cow skull. That my former PhD student Emily Bamfield looked at as part of her PhD. It comes from the Neolithic long barrow of Beckhampton Road in Wiltshire. So if we think about what could a Neolithic body do, and what could a dead Neolithic body do? If we think about a body that's been fragmented, it can do all sorts of different kinds of things. It can be in different places at once. It can reach out across the landscape. It can move through time. You can bury one part of a body in a causewayed enclosure ditch and keep another part out for 30 or 40 years, referring back to it, and then bury it close by to that previous bit of body. That's something that people did, for example, at Hambledon Hill in Dorset, a causewayed enclosure. You can take bits of bodies and place them in rivers, or you can put them into long barrows, or you can put them into pits. You can do all sorts of things when a body is fragmented. And those are things that you can't do when you keep a body whole. It buries everything in the same thing. And so we can think about there about how all those kind of differential flows of energy that I was talking about in making those material bodies like pots and stone axes, which have gone into making the antler mace head, or the Live Slow pottery vessel, or into those edge polished knives, or into the kite-shaped arrowheads or the boar's tusks that are buried in that grave there. All of the different kind of processes of making, the relationships those are involved, all of these involve different forms of connectivity and flow and history being bound together and then caught up in a single kind of place. So rather than spreading across the landscape and being moved around and exchanged and forming new relations and new histories, they become to be knitted and brought together. The term Deleuze would use is territorialized into a very specific kind of point in the landscape. And this does different things. A dead body that's buried whole is capable of different things than a body that's being fragmented. In the case of the cow at Beckhampton Road, it's a fascinating study, one of the really brilliant piece of work by Emily and her co-authors on this, where Beckhampton Road is a really interesting long barrow because it doesn't have any human remains in it. And archaeologists have long puzzled over this. Long barrows are supposed to be funerary monuments. Why do we get monuments without any human remains? What it does have is, in particular, 3 cow skulls that may have been stood up on posts along the kind of run of the long barrow. And the middle one is this one here. And that fracture on the front of the skull is really interesting because it's where someone struck the cow with a polished stone axe. But the cow didn't die. It may have fallen over, it may have been stunned, it presumably would have been bleeding, but we know that fracture healed. So you can imagine the scene at Beckhampton Road 5,000 years ago or so. Beckhampton Road's not brilliantly dated. Of someone smashing a cow on the head, it's falling over, it looks like it's dead, and then it comes back from the dead. And it's that cow that ends up buried in a long barrow. So the thing this cow's body could do was different to other cattle, and that emerged through the specific histories and relations, the difference that it made in the world through the kind of history that it had. Its body is fragmented. I mean, people may well have gone on to eat that cow and all those sorts of things. It could do different things. It could form new relationships afterwards. But by attending to what these different kinds of bodies can do, humans and non-humans, we can begin to explore funerary practices in quite different kinds of ways. So if we're going to extract, in my previous kind of vignette, I talked about how Neolithic matter moved people. And I think here we can think about a different kind of concept we can extract from that discussion. And that's thinking about those flows that shape Neolithic worlds, the flows of people and things that are moving together, the flows that shape bodies, and then that shape how bodies are treated in death, whether they're disarticulated and move around landscapes, whether they're put into chambered tombs where they're rotting down can be monitored, whether they're broken apart, whether they're put back together, whether they're gathered into a singular spot like at Lifts Low and bound into a particular kind of location where those flows in effect come to be captured. And this might be something we're seeing. This is the Neolithic burial site of Duggleby Howe in Yorkshire, where we know of a sequence of really interesting burials stretching from the kind of end of the early Neolithic through and the burial sequence to the start of the late Neolithic, and then later cremations get deposited in the mound as well. We have a whole series of burials here involving both articulated and disarticulated bodies. There's a skull buried with one of the whole bodies. There are other disarticulated bundles of bones that go in, and also articulated individuals buried with what we might think of as typically high prestige grave goods. I think we can actually think about those grave goods in much more interesting ways, but that's probably a talk for another time. And Duggleby Howe is really different from Lifts Low, where we get that one-off burial. Here we see the event happening again and again, people coming back and acting to differentiate the site, repeating those acts of making this difference through repetition, through the acts of burial hill, binding these flows again and again into a particular place. So if bodies and objects are emerging out of these flows of humans and non-humans, flows of energy, flows of substance in the Neolithic world, we can also see how these flows can be captured. And because this is in contrast to what's happening to other bodies that are carrying on being circulated, that are being fragmented even in death, we can see this as particular moments where this happens historically, particular moments of time where this becomes important. So let's move to my last vignette then. How long have we been talking about? 40 minutes. Okay, we should be wrapping up pretty much on time. From one mound to another mound. The previous mound was, of course, Duggleby Howe, and this needs no further explanation. I'm sure most people recognize it immediately as Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric mound in Europe. An incredible site, long debated about what it was for. Many people thought there must be burials in the center of it, the biggest burial mound ever. And of course, we know that's not true, particularly through the work of people like Alistair writing up older excavations, and the more recent kind of reanalysis of the site by Jim Leary and Dave Field and others have kind of pulled together a really excellent understanding of how this site develops through time. Just let me check whether I want to say this on this slide or the next one. Yeah, the site's constructed at the kind of end of the Neolithic, perhaps around 2400 BC, in a world where beakers are kind of coming on the scene, but aren't probably established yet. One of the really important pieces of work that I'll come back to in a moment is that Jim Leary's study of the architecture of the mound has shown how this isn't a kind of singular creation. It's not just people building it up in one go, but actually emerges from a whole series of quite complex architectural procedures involving a number of smaller mounds, perhaps encased by a bank that kind of form a kind of enclosure, and then series of ditches being dug that lead to the kind of growing of the mound in quite complex ways. This takes place over about 50 years or so and involves bringing in different kinds of materials from different parts of the landscape, leading to a mound that's always in motion, as Leary calls it. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about this particular site. And I'll come back to that more in a moment. So how might we think differently about monuments? So there's another Deleuze book for this is Deleuze's book on Foucault. And here I want to think a little bit about power. Monuments have been always associated with power in the Neolithic, right? You can have Renfrew's classic model in the 1970s of a series of chiefdoms emerging in the Neolithic, culminating with paramount chiefs at sites like Stonehenge and Silbury Hill playing critical roles in that. But even people like John Barrett, writing from a very different theoretical perspective, would see the emergence of a site like Silbury Hill as being a site that plays a role in causing people to become extremely powerful. So Barrett argued, for example, that the flat top of Silbury Hill that you can see there would have allowed a certain number of individuals to be elevated to the top of it and above everybody else, and this has consequences and makes them more powerful. So the kind of classic argument that he sets out in Fragments from Antiquity. But there are probably other ways to think about power in this period. And that's something where Foucault's work and Deleuze's work on Foucault is really, really important. In his book on Foucault, and it's a really sad story, Deleuze and Foucault's friendship. They were great friends. They had a kind of big falling out. And then Foucault on his deathbed calls out and says, I want to see Deleuze one last time. And Deleuze rushes there, but doesn't get there before Foucault dies. And in his grief, Deleuze writes this book about Foucault, about his work. Deleuze wrote a huge number of books on philosophers, but one of the great studies was on his friend Foucault. And in this, Deleuze emphasizes how for Foucault, power is seductive. It allows you to do things. It's not merely oppressive, but also how power is historically contextual. It's historically emergent. It's relational, if you like. It's not something that exists in the same time in different kinds of places. So Foucault writes about how we can think about how power changes from the kind of sovereign power of the medieval period through new forms of disciplinary power in the 17th and 18th century in prisons and factories and in the army and in schools, through to the emergence of biopower, which operates through medical practices, through the census, which we probably all should be filling in. Is it today? I think it's today, the census, isn't it? Got to fill mine in, otherwise get fined. All those kinds of different forms of power that operate for Foucault. And recently, the philosopher Brian Masumi, the guy who actually translated Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus from French, has written about ontopower, which he calls the kind of modern power that we have now, where both governments attempt to anticipate criminal activity, which leads to the assassination of terrorists or alleged terrorists before they've carried out crimes, but also how ontopower works in financial markets to leverage predicted things that are going to happen, what's about to happen, the possibility of potential, what could happen, to elevate other kinds of power. So if power is emerging in different kinds of ways in different kinds of periods, that's really important to think about. And I think it's really important for archaeologists because the way in which monuments relate to power has, I would suggest, been rather radically misunderstood. And I apologize for the quite obscene imagery of the next image. Yes, Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, has deployed Neolithic monuments in an attempt to wield his own power, appearing at Stanton Drew, the Neolithic stone circle, in a party political broadcast, using Stanton Drew as evidence that we never needed the French anyway, we've always been good without them. What have they got to do with Neolithic monuments anyway? I mean, showing his ignorance of all forms of Neolithic archaeology, of course, but also I think actually revealing quite interesting concepts about monuments and power and individuals and politics that actually may not be that far away from how we have thought about power ourselves in archaeology as being related to individual people and the way in which monuments lend them authority and legitimacy and all those sorts of things. So whilst I wouldn't accuse even Colin Renfrew as a Tory peer of holding exactly the same views as Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm sure he doesn't. I hope he doesn't. Nonetheless, I think there are continuities in the conception of power at play there with the way in which Jacob Rees-Mogg is deploying this in the present. And if we think about how Neolithic monuments are used for modern political purposes, that kind of behooves us to rethink power when it comes to these monuments. So let's go back to Silbury Hill, and thanks to Jim Leary for this image of the inside of the monument from the work that he and his team did there. This kind of captures what looks like a singular construction. You can see all the complexities, the multiplicity of phases of architecture that are taking place at a site like this. Silbury's not sort of one thing when we look at it like this. It's multiple things. It's not happening once. It's not just constructed. It's happening again and again and again. Banks are being built. Ditches are being dug. This is hard work. Josh Pollard refers to it as backbreaking when he's talking about those acts of digging these ditches you can see on the kind of right-hand side of the section here that leads to the piling up of these different kinds of things. I think if we talk about this in terms of the power of chiefs or even of individual people, we're dealing with really anachronistic views of power that aren't located in the Neolithic at all. I mean, almost 20 years ago, Julian Thomas talked about this in his paper, Taking Power Seriously, and he kind of asks Neolithic archaeologists to think about what a Neolithic mode of power might be. And I think in a way it's staring us in the face here. When we start thinking about materials as moving people, as I was discussing earlier, as I was thinking about how these different materials are brought together, capturing flows of relations, capturing flows of people, capturing flows of bodies, we can start seeing how power itself is emergent from the monument, not in the sense that it's giving power to people, but that the monument itself becomes a site of congealed power, a site where power pools and swells and pauses momentarily, gathering more materials to it, acting like a centrifugal force, bringing in people and things again and again and again, not just happening once, but happening again. So here I want to suggest that we can think not of the kind of hierarchy of chiefdoms, the kind of sovereign power that Foucault identifies in the medieval period and is basically the form of power that Renfrew sees in the Neolithic. And of course, not of the disciplinary power or the biopower or the ontopower that Foucault and Masumi talk about. Those are entirely anachronistic as well, naturally. But perhaps we can talk about monupower. about the power that monuments have as they emerge as the ongoing process of the world happening again and again, of the world emerging through these acts of building, these places where power, as I said, congeal together. So power here isn't a possession. It's not something people have or a monument has for that matter. It's a quality of relationships. It's a force in the world of things pressing into each other. The kind of historically emergent power that I'm talking about here of monupower. The emerging and interweaving of bodies and materials that allow this form of power to emerge. And this power in turn builds Neolithic worlds. I think here we can think really interestingly about how the vision of monuments as static and the same and unchanging that Rees-Mogg is drawing on really explicitly in that party political broadcast fundamentally misunderstands the power of monuments themselves. The power of monuments comes from the fact they don't just happen once. To quote the philosopher Henri Bergson, who is one of Deleuze's great inspirations, the more we study the nature of time, the more we shall comprehend that duration means intervention, the creation of forms, the continual elaboration of the new. At the Ring of Brodka, when we see stones falling down, when we see them being moved there, when ditches are being dug, this is the continual elaboration of the new. It's not a static thing with a singular design behind it. It's the ongoing outcome of historical processes of difference making in the world. So to move to kind of my conclusion then, there are three kind of concepts that have emerged from the talk I've tried to talk about, the three Neolithic concepts that I've talked about today. That Neolithic matter moved people, that Neolithic flows shape Neolithic worlds, and that Neolithic flows could be captured. And monupower, or to put it slightly differently, Neolithic monuments assembled power. Now, these concepts have emerged out of the intersection of philosophy and archaeology and archaeologists. I'd argue they're historically contingent, but they are ontological in a sense about how Neolithic worlds work. They're specific to that kind of period. Now, one worry we might have about this is the extent to which are these really Neolithic concepts, or are they just Deleuzian ones taken from the present and thrust back into the past? Are they what Ben Alberti, who's very wary of approaches like the one I've described today, call a meta-ontology? Am I simply imposing one vision of the present onto the past? I don't think so. I think what Deleuzian philosophy gives us in conjunction with the material from the past is the opportunity to bring these things into conversation and to allow genuinely new things to emerge. And this is what the famous anthropologist Viveros de Castro found when he took Deleuzian philosophy and encountered the ontologies of Amerindian people. Viveros de Castro describes his work as a becoming Deleuzian of Amerindian ethnology and a certain becoming Indian of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. And perhaps we can replace that here with a becoming Deleuzian of Neolithic archaeology and a certain becoming Neolithic of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. Monupower isn't anywhere to be found in Deleuze and Guattari's oeuvre. It emerges through the conversations that they have together with one another. So the three concepts I've kind of outlined very briefly today are three of the 9 concepts that I outline in my book, drawing on this combination of theory and empirical data. And there are plenty of questions you may well have. What are the other concepts? How can we map these concepts through space and time? How do they change and flow? Are they the same all the way through the Neolithic, or do they have historical trajectories of their own? I mean, what kinds of time do we need? What concepts of time do we need to develop in order to be able to talk about concepts at all? Do they operate only within the empirical world, or are they what Deleuze and Guattari or Deleuze would call virtual as well as actual? And what does this all mean for the Neolithic, how we think about it, for archaeology as a discipline, and where we might be going next? Well, to find the answer to that, I'm afraid you'll have to read the book. Thanks very much indeed.